In 1971, an Australian brigadier watched 3 teenage Vietnamese girls demonstrate a skill that had killed 55 of his countrymen. They shuffled forward barefoot, toes probing soft earth for metal prongs. When they found one, they knelt, felt beneath for grenades, then used hairpins to neutralize fuses designed by American engineers. These girls had helped supply thousands of mines to Viet Cong forces. Between May of 1969 and May of 1970, Australian soldiers operating in southern WWII province faced a mathematical reality that defied belief. They were more likely to be killed or wounded by their own mines than by enemy action. Casualties from mines lifted and redeployed by the enemy accounted for more than 50% of all Australian losses, spiking at some points to 80%. This is the documented account of how one of Australia's most capable military forces created their own greatest threat and what happened when expertise collided with a fundamental misunderstanding of who the enemy was. On the 17th of February, 1967, the 6th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment clashed with 2 companies from the Viet Cong D445 Battalion, reinforced by North Vietnamese regulars in dense jungle northwest of Hoi Mai. The battle that became known as Operation Bribey lasted a week. When it ended, 16 Australians were dead and 55 wounded. The heaviest casualties the task force had sustained to that point in the war. The engagement had begun when D Company, 6 RAR, encountered the enemy force while conducting a search and destroy operation. The Viet Cong, rather than withdrawing as they often did when facing Australian units, chose to stand and fight. The battle evolved into a running engagement through difficult terrain, with both sides taking significant casualties. Australian artillery and air support were called in repeatedly, but the dense jungle canopy limited their effectiveness. By the time the operation concluded on the 23rd of February, the tactical victory had come at a price that shocked commanders at all levels. For Brigadier Stuart Clarence Graham, commander of the 1st Australian Task Force, the losses underscored a problem that had dominated his thinking since taking command in January. Graham had only 2 infantry battalions to control all of Phu Oc Tuy province, a region southeast of Saigon with a population of 160,000 and a well-earned reputation as a Viet Cong stronghold. The province was critical to South Vietnam's survival, home to the vital port at Vung Tau where American supplies arrived, and Route 15, the main supply line to Saigon and the airbase at Bien Hoa. Operating in the province were the 274th and 275th National Liberation Front regiments, along with the D445 Provincial Battalion. These weren't poorly trained guerrillas learning tactics as they fought. They were experienced units that had been fighting for years, first against the French and then against the South Vietnamese army. They knew the terrain intimately, had established extensive tunnel systems and supply caches, and enjoyed significant support from the local population in certain districts. Graham was 46 years old, a graduate of the Royal Military College Dun Truon, with service dating to 1940. He'd seen combat in the Second World War and held various command and staff positions through the Korean conflict. His peers regarded him as one of the most talented officers of his generation, a reputation built on demonstrated competence in staff work and tactical command. The problem he faced in Phu Oc Tuy was simple in outline, impossible in execution. 2 battalions weren't enough to control a province this size against an enemy this capable. Australian doctrine, learned through the Malayan emergency, emphasized population control and denying insurgents access to their support base. But the Malayan model required sufficient forces to maintain a constant presence in contested areas. Graham didn't have those forces. He'd requested a 3rd battalion and armored support. The Australian government, unable or unwilling to commit additional forces to what was already an unpopular war at home, had denied the request. No reinforcements were coming. Political realities in Canberra meant Graham would have to accomplish his mission with the resources he had. Graham needed a force multiplier, some way to deny the Viet Cong freedom of movement between their bases in the Long Hai Mountains and the rice-growing villages of Long Dat district in the southwest, where the enemy obtained supplies and recruits. The Long Hai Range, a rocky massif covered in dense jungle, had served as a resistance stronghold since the French colonial period. Its caves and tunnel systems provided virtually impregnable defensive positions. Intelligence reports indicated that the area housed major Viet Cong installations, including hospitals, supply depots, and command facilities. The villages of Long Dat district, spread across the coastal plain west of the Australian base at Nui Dat, were predominantly ethnic Vietnamese who had lived in the area for generations. Graham's intelligence assessments suggested these villages were providing material support to Viet Cong forces, though the extent and nature of that support remained unclear. After Operation Bribey, Graham concluded that a physical barrier was necessary. What he ordered built would stretch 11 kilometers from a position called the Horseshoe near Dat Du village to the coast at Lang Phuoc Hai. The barrier would consist of 2 wire fences with a minefield between them, designed to sever what Graham believed was a vital Viet Cong supply route. The mines themselves were American M16 anti-personnel devices, about the size of a large jam tin, 10 centimeters in diameter, 12 centimeters high, 19 centimeters with the M605 fuse installed. The mine weighed 3.5 kilograms, including half a kilogram of TNT, packed between steel inner and outer casings. The M16 was called a jumping jack because when pressure of 8 to 12 kilograms activated its trigger, a propelling charge launched the mine approximately 4 feet into the air before the main charge detonated, spraying high-velocity iron fragments in a 360-degree pattern. The design was intended to maximize casualties. A mine exploding at ground level could be partially shielded by terrain, but one detonating at chest height had clear line of effect to multiple targets. In Vietnam, an M16 explosion averaged 6 casualties, with 27 recorded on one occasion when a North Vietnamese Army unit walked into a minefield in column formation. The blast radius was approximately 30 meters, though fragments could cause injury at greater distances. Between the 6th of March and the 1st of June, 1967, sappers from 1st Field Squadron, Royal Australian Engineers, laid more than 20,000 of these mines across 11 kilometers of varied terrain. Paddy fields, jungle margins, coastal areas, and sandy soil near the coast. The work was physically demanding and dangerous. Each mine had to be carefully positioned, armed, and recorded. The engineers worked in teams, moving forward methodically, marking positions on maps as they progressed. The heat was oppressive, the work exhausting, and the knowledge that a single mistake could trigger a mine that would kill or maim the handler created constant tension. On the 25th of May, the squadron's operations log recorded the daily progress. Mines laid today, 1,348. Total mines with anti-lift, 2,088. Total mines without anti-lift, 1,148. Grand total, 3,236. The notation was matter of fact, the routine documentation of engineering work proceeding according to schedule. Many of the mines were fitted with M5 anti-lift devices, small mechanisms the Americans called mouse traps, designed to detonate if someone attempted to remove the mine from the ground. The anti-lift device was a separate fuse that would trigger if the mine was tilted or lifted. theoretically making it impossible to safely remove the mine without specialized equipment and training. In practice, as events would prove, the M5 was vulnerable to patient, methodical defeat by individuals willing to accept the risk. Major Brian Florence, the senior task force engineer, warned Graham that the anti-lift devices would not be sufficient to prevent a determined enemy from lifting the mines. Florence understood mine warfare from both theoretical study and practical experience. He knew that no anti-lift device was foolproof, and that given time and access, a patient adversary could develop techniques to neutralize even well-designed protective measures. He also understood the political dimension. The villages, the western side of the plant barrier, were inhabited by Vietnamese who might not welcome the physical division of their communities and farmland. Lieutenant Colonel John War, commanding officer of 5 RAR and a Korean War veteran, understood from first-hand experience that anti-personnel mines were a two-edged sword. In Korea, War had seen how mines laid defensively could become hazards to friendly forces when tactical situations changed, and how difficult it was to maintain accurate records of mine locations once combat operations displaced units or destroyed documentation. Both men advised against the barrier strategy, expressing their concerns through proper channels. Graham listened to their advice, acknowledged their expertise, and proceeded anyway. The decision was his to make, and he believed the strategic situation required accepting the risks his subordinates had identified. The plan called for South Vietnamese regional forces to guard the western side of the minefield while Australian patrols monitored the eastern approaches. This division of responsibility was necessary given the limited Australian forces available, but it created a fundamental vulnerability. Graham's own intelligence had assessed the local South Vietnamese forces as completely ineffective, poorly trained, inadequately equipped, suffering from low morale and questionable loyalty. Yet the barrier strategy relied on these same forces to prevent enemy access to thousands of powerful mines. The contradiction was apparent to officers at multiple levels of command, but the operational reality offered no better alternatives. Australian forces couldn't guard both sides of an 11-kilometer barrier while simultaneously conducting offensive operations throughout the province. Something had to give, and the decision was made to accept the risk on the western side, while hoping that the difficulty of lifting mines would deter organized recovery efforts. By early June of 1967, the barrier was complete. 5 Australian engineers had been killed during the laying operation when mines detonated prematurely during installation. 6 more had been wounded. These casualties were considered acceptable losses for a major engineering project in a combat zone, though each death affected morale and reminded the sappers of the constant danger they faced. The barrier itself was an impressive achievement from an engineering perspective. 11 kilometers of cleared ground, 2 parallel wire fences, and over 20,000 mines laid in carefully plotted patterns and documented on detailed maps. Initially, the minefield appeared to achieve its objective. Viet Cong movement through the area was disrupted. Local villagers reported that Viet Cong forces were being forced to use longer routes to move between the Long Hai Mountains and the coastal villages. Graham could report to higher command that the force multiplier was functioning as designed, that Australian forces were controlling territory far beyond what their numbers would normally allow. Within weeks, the Viet Cong response would prove every warning correct. The mines lifted from the barrier minefield didn't vanish into storage depots or get destroyed. They reappeared, systematically and lethally, deployed with a sophistication that demonstrated the enemy understood both Australian tactics and the psychology of soldiers operating in mined terrain. The response was organized, deliberate, and executed with impressive discipline. The mine-lifting operations began almost immediately after the barrier's completion, In the villages of Long Dat district, the National Liberation Front organized what they called mine-lifting emulation movements, coordinated campaigns that involved entire communities in the work of recovering the Australian mines. The campaigns were structured like other mass mobilization efforts, common in communist revolutionary warfare. Quotas were established, teams were formed and trained, work was supervised by political cadres, and success was celebrated through public recognition and awards. The lifters worked in teams, often at night when Australian patrols were less likely to be operating near the minefield, mostly barefoot because boots would have prevented them from feeling the distinctive sensation of mine prongs beneath the soil. They moved forward in lines, 8 to 10 centimeters apart, feeling with their toes through grass and soft earth for the distinctive metal prongs of the M16's pressure fuse. The technique required extraordinary courage and patience. Each step forward was a calculated risk. Finding a mine meant stopping, kneeling, and beginning the delicate work of excavation and neutralization, while knowing that a single mistake would mean death or catastrophic injury. When they located a mine, they would kneel and carefully excavate around it with small tools, removing soil a few grains at a time, checking first for the M26 hand grenade that Viet Cong engineers had begun placing beneath lifted mines as an additional booby trap for anyone attempting to recover them a second time. If a grenade was present, pin removed, striker held down only by the weight of the mine above it, they would neutralize it with a hairpin, the same simple tool they used to disable the mine's own fusing mechanism. The hairpin, thin enough to slide between components, strong enough to provide leverage, became the symbol of how low-technology solutions could defeat sophisticated military engineering. A collector followed behind the lifting teams, gathering the neutralized mines into baskets, which were then transported to collection points for distribution to Viet Cong combat units. On a productive night, a single team of 8 to 10 lifters could recover 150 mines. Over weeks and months, these incremental efforts accumulated into thousands of mines transferred from Australian control to Viet Cong arsenals. The work was dangerous. Several lifters were killed or wounded when mines detonated during recovery operations. But the casualties were considered acceptable by the National Liberation Front leadership, given the military value of the weapons being obtained. Each M16 mine recovered represented a capability the Viet Cong couldn't manufacture themselves, couldn't obtain through their normal supply channels from North Vietnam or China, and could deploy with devastating effect against the forces that had laid it. By August or September of 1967, just 3 to 4 months after the barrier's completion, as many as 2,000 M16 mines had reached the People's District Committee for Long Dat. The number comes from Australian intelligence assessments, based on interrogation of prisoners, analysis of captured documents, and observations by patrols operating in the area. A captured document found by 9RAR in May of 1969 recorded a resolution by the Viet Cong's Long Dat District Committee to destroy the Australians' fence and remove and collect 1,000 mines. The document, translated and analyzed by intelligence officers, proved what Australian commanders were beginning to understand through the mounting casualties. The mine lifting wasn't opportunistic scavenging by individuals, but organized, systematic operations planned at the district level and executed with discipline and courage. The document detailed specific responsibilities assigned to village committees, quotas for mine collection, and methods for defeating the anti-lift devices. It was, in effect, a tactical manual for dismantling the Australian barrier and converting it into an offensive weapon system. The Australian engineers had laid the mines in precise patterns according to standard doctrine, rows with specific spacing, marked on maps, designed to create overlapping fields of effect. This precision, necessary for defensive effectiveness and for allowing Australian forces to navigate through safe lanes, initially made the barrier easier to defend because patrols knew where mines should be. But once the Viet Cong understood the pattern, it made finding the mines easier as well. Using two hands with thumbs together, an experienced lifter could probe for adjacent mines quickly once the first one was found. The spacing was consistent, the depth of burial was uniform, and the patterns were logical. What had been engineered for military efficiency became a vulnerability exploited by an enemy who studied the barrier systematically and developed specific techniques to defeat it. The Vietnamese, both the villagers doing the lifting and the Viet Cong fighters who deployed the recovered mines, called the barrier minefield Co Tung Vu Ki, which translates as the arsenal. The name captured the bitter irony of the situation. What Australia had built as a defensive barrier had become an ammunition dump for the enemy. Australian soldiers, with the dark humor of men living under constant threat, called it the same thing. The .do mine store. The shared terminology, arising independently in two different languages, reflected a common understanding of what the barrier had become. Officers tried to suppress the nickname among Australian troops, viewing it as damaging to morale. But the name persisted because it accurately described the reality soldiers were experiencing in the field. Graham had assumed the barrier would protect the villages of Long Dat from Viet Cong incursions and prevent the enemy from obtaining supplies and recruits from the local population. The assumption rested on a fundamental misreading of the political situation, a misunderstanding rooted in conventional military thinking about insurgency that failed to account for the specific historical and cultural context of rural Phuoc Tuy province. The people of Long Dat weren't victims waiting to be protected from the Viet Cong. Many were the Viet Cong's support base, families with sons and daughters serving in the local force units, farmers who provided rice and vegetables to resistance forces, villagers who had supported the Viet Minh against the French and now supported the National Liberation Front against the Americans and their allies. They didn't need protection from the Viet Cong. They were providing not just supplies and recruits, but the labor force that systematically dismantled Graham's barrier and converted it into the enemy's primary offensive weapon. The three teenage girls who demonstrated their mine-lifting technique for Brigadier Flint in 1971 were part of this system. They had defected by then, their reasons for leaving the National Liberation Front unknown, but likely related to war weariness or family circumstances rather than ideological conversion. During their time working for the National Liberation Front, they'd helped supply the arsenal that would kill and wound hundreds of Allied soldiers. The demonstration they provided was clinical in its detail, delivered without apparent emotion or propaganda, simply showing the technique as they'd learned and practiced it. They showed how they'd shuffled forward barefoot, how they'd felt for the prongs, how they'd neutralized the grenades and fuses with hairpins. One girl demonstrated the exact hand position for feeling beneath a mine for a booby trap grenade, fingers spread wide, moving with deliberate slowness, checking the entire circumference before committing to lifting. Another showed how the hairpin was inserted into the fusing mechanism, the precise angle required, the gentle pressure needed to defeat the anti-lift device without triggering detonation. The technique was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its effectiveness. Brigadier Flint, watching this demonstration in 1971, was seeing an explanation for casualties that had already occurred. These girls, probably 15 to 17 years old, working barefoot in darkness with tools pulled from their own hair, had helped defeat a major military engineering project designed by professional soldiers and executed with modern technology. By the time these girls showed him their method, the damage was done. The 55 dead couldn't be brought back. The 250 wounded couldn't be made whole. The lesson was being learned years too late to prevent the disaster it explained. The mines reappeared throughout southern Phuoc Tuy province, beginning in late 1967. The Viet Cong didn't use them as obstacles in the traditional sense, placing them to block avenues of approach or to channel enemy movement into predetermined kill zones covered by fire. Instead, they used the mines as offensive weapons, placing them anywhere Australian soldiers were likely to move. On tracks, in likely ambush positions, in areas where patrols might establish harbor sites for the night, around villages, near stream crossings, along the edges of clearings where helicopters might land. The deployment pattern reflected sophisticated understanding of Australian patrol tactics, knowledge gained through observation and through intelligence, provided by villagers who watched Australian movements and reported patterns to local Viet Cong commanders. The Viet Cong kept their deployed mines under surveillance when possible. As soon as an Australian patrol passed through an area and cleared it using mine detectors and careful searching, enemy forces would move back in under cover of darkness and remine the same ground. They were disciplined about marking mine locations so their own troops and the local villagers wouldn't walk into them. The markers were cleverly concealed. A particular arrangement of stones, a bent branch, a specific plant species growing in an unusual location. Details that would mean nothing to an Australian patrol, but were clear indicators to those who knew what to look for. The tactical innovations the Viet Cong developed for deploying the lifted mines demonstrated both technical skill and deep understanding of Australian procedures. One technique involved placing a snail, a common garden snail of a type abundant in the area, on top of the mine's 3 protruding prongs, in the jungle's mottled light, or in an open paddy field where snails were common. The gastropod became nearly invisible camouflage. The snail's shell, typically brown or tan, blended with the soil coloration. From above, a soldier's view angle, the mine's prongs were hidden beneath the snail's body. A soldier's natural reaction upon seeing a snail was to step on it, either deliberately to crush a minor pest or accidentally while focusing on distant threats. Either way, the result was the same. 8 kilograms of pressure, the fuse triggering, the mine launching upward. Another innovation was more sophisticated and more deadly. Viet Cong engineers would dig beneath a deployed M16 mine and place an M26 hand grenade in the excavated space. They'd pull the grenade's pin, leaving only the weight of the mine above to hold down the striker. The grenade became a secondary fusing system, one that couldn't be detected from above and wasn't defeated by standard mine-clearing procedures. When Australian combat engineers attempted to clear the mine using the doctrine they'd been trained on, making it safe at the top by unscrewing the fusing device, then lifting the mine from the ground, the grenade beneath would detonate. The technique was learned through blood. Early in 1968, multiple Australian engineer teams were caught by this booby trap before new clearing procedures were developed that required excavating completely around and beneath any mine before attempting to move it. Private Gordon S. Wise, writing to his family several weeks before he died, described the psychological burden of operating in mine-saturated terrain with the blunt clarity of a soldier who understood exactly what he faced and wanted his family to understand it too. Mines are a horrible, senseless device that do nothing more than slow us down, he wrote. We'd rather take on 1,000 enemy in a firefight than have to walk through a known minefield. The preference Wise expressed wasn't bravado or masculine posturing. It reflected a rational calculation about survival and agency. In a firefight, training mattered. Individual skill and unit cohesion influenced outcomes. A good soldier could take cover, return effective fire, maneuver to advantage. In a minefield, skill and training offered only marginal protection. Every step was a gamble. The best soldier and the worst had essentially equal chances of triggering a mine on any given step. Survival became a matter of statistics and luck rather than competence, a reality that gnawed at professional soldiers who took pride in their skills. Wise was walking point for his platoon on the 6th of August, 1970, when he hit what he described as a pressure release type mine, a mine that detonated when weight was removed from the pressure plate rather than when weight was applied, making it virtually impossible to stop the detonation sequence once the plate was stepped on. He lost most of his left leg and his left hand. The medical evacuation was rapid, the treatment professional, the prognosis from the beginning poor. 2 days later, from his hospital bed in Chu Lai, knowing he was dying, he dictated a last letter to his family. He died on the 13th of August, 1970. He was 20 years old. His death was recorded as a combat casualty, which was technically accurate. But the weapon that killed him had been manufactured in the United States, transported to Vietnam by the American military, provided to Australian forces as part of Allied cooperation, laid by Australian engineers, lifted by Vietnamese villagers, and deployed by Viet Cong forces specifically to kill Australian soldiers. The chain of causation was, long and complicated. But it began with the decision made by Brigadier Graham in February of 1967. Australian forces responded to the mine threat, with every countermeasure their training and experience suggested. Mine detectors became mandatory equipment for all patrols. Despite the added weight and the fact that the detectors produced frequent false alarms from metal fragments, shell casings, and other battlefield debris. Soldiers wore flak jackets despite the oppressive heat and humidity that made the heavy protective gear almost unbearable during long patrols. Steel helmets were required instead of the lighter bush hats most troops preferred, adding more weight to already heavy loads that included weapons, ammunition, water, rations, and communications equipment. Vehicle floors were lined with sandbags to absorb blast effects from mines detonated by vehicle weight. Routes and work sites were cleared before use, though the clearing process itself created casualties. When mines were encountered or booby traps were triggered, special training emphasized mine awareness and proper clearing techniques, with refresher courses conducted regularly and lessons learned disseminated after each incident. Units developed standard operating procedures for movement in mine threat areas. Spacing between soldiers increased to limit casualties from any single detonation. Point men were rotated frequently to distribute risk. Rally points were established before entering danger areas, and casualty evacuation procedures were rehearsed until they became automatic. None of it was enough. The countermeasures reduced casualties at the margins, but couldn't eliminate the fundamental problem. The sheer density of mines scattered across the operational area, combined with the Viet Cong's practice of constantly remining cleared ground, meant that every patrol operated under the assumption that the next step could trigger an explosion. There was no safe movement. Trails were obviously dangerous, mined as a matter of course. Yet moving off trails meant pushing through dense vegetation where mines could be hidden, and where the physical effort of moving through jungle increased heat casualties and exhausted soldiers before contact with the enemy. Harbor sites that seemed secure one night might be mined by morning if Viet Cong scouts observed the position and reported it to mine-laying teams. Even fire support bases, supposedly secure rear areas, were occasionally penetrated by sappers who placed mines along frequently used paths within the perimeter. The psychological toll accumulated with each patrol, each careful step, each metallic beep from the detector that might indicate a mine, or might just be shrapnel from a previous explosion. Soldiers developed superstitions, personal rituals performed before patrols, lucky charms carried against rational understanding. The irrational behaviors were coping mechanisms for a situation where rational precautions provided incomplete protection. In early 1968, Brigadier Hughes, who had succeeded Graham as task force commander, ordered a reconnaissance-enforced mission to destroy Viet Cong base installations in the Long Hai Mountains. The Long Hai Massif was a rocky, jungle-covered range that rose abruptly from the coastal plain, its highest point reaching just over 300 meters elevation. The area had served as a stronghold for Vietnamese resistance forces since the French Indochina War. Its terrain was incredibly difficult. Steep slopes, dense vegetation, rocky outcrops that provided natural fortifications, and an extensive network of caves and tunnels developed over decades. Intelligence identified it as the location of the Minh Dam Secret Zone, a major Viet Cong base complex that included training facilities, supply depots, and administrative centers. And K-76A, the main hospital for Military Region T7, which accepted casualties from main force units operating across multiple provinces. The hospital was reportedly equipped with surgical facilities, a blood bank, and trained medical personnel, including doctors who had studied in Hanoi or Eastern Europe. The area had been subjected to heavy bombardment from B-52 strikes and naval gunfire in preparation for the ground assault. The preparatory fires were intended to destroy enemy installations, disrupt defensive preparations, and reduce the threat to Australian forces during the ground phase. The 3rd Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, reinforced with engineer support and additional fire support assets, moved into the Long Hai foothills expecting to encounter enemy forces defending their installations. The plan called for a systematic advance through the target area, with companies moving along parallel axes, clearing bunker systems and tunnel complexes, destroying supplies and facilities. Intelligence had warned that the area would be heavily defended, that casualties were likely, that this would be a difficult operation requiring careful execution and aggressive tactics. What they encountered instead was terrain that the Viet Cong had saturated with M16 mines, lifted from the barrier minefield. The mines had survived the bombardment, buried in earth that absorbed the blast effects of bombs and artillery shells that cratered the landscape above them, but left mines buried 30 or 40 centimeters deep, essentially undamaged. Operation Pinnaroo lasted less than 2 weeks. 15 Australians were killed. 33 were wounded. Not a single shot was exchanged with enemy forces during the entire operation. Every casualty came from mines. Australian mines, laid by Australian engineers, lifted by Vietnamese villagers, deployed by Viet Cong forces to defend positions against Australian assault. The operation demonstrated with brutal clarity that the Long Hai Mountains had become operationally inaccessible to conventional infantry assault. Each mine casualty required evacuation, which meant establishing helicopter landing zones, which meant clearing ground where more mines might be buried. The clearing teams hit mines while attempting to secure landing zones. The evacuation routes were mined, forcing helicopters to hover, while wounded soldiers were winched up on rescue hoists, exposing the aircraft to potential fire and the hovering crews to additional mine detonations if rotor wash detonated unstable ordnance. The defensive positions troops established while waiting for evacuation sat in potentially mined terrain, meaning soldiers couldn't move, couldn't dig in properly, couldn't establish proper security without risking additional casualties. The mathematics of the operation were straightforward and damning. Casualties were mounting faster than objectives could be achieved, and the primary threat wasn't enemy soldiers, but Australian technology turned weapon. Each casualty required 4 to 6 soldiers to evacuate. 2 to carry the stretcher, 1 to provide security forward, 1 to provide security rear, 1 to control the evacuation route, and a medic to provide care during movement. An operation that began with a battalion-strength force found itself with combat power degrading rapidly as more soldiers were diverted to casualty evacuation and security tasks. Battalion commanders faced impossible decisions. Continue advancing and accept mounting casualties from mines, or withdraw and concede that terrain to the enemy. The decision to withdraw was made at task force level, a tacit acknowledgement that the cost of operating in the Longhai Mountains exceeded any plausible tactical benefit that could be achieved. The Viet Cong didn't need to defend their positions with soldiers when Australian mines did the work more effectively than any conventional defense could manage. Rod Hill, who served with 8 RAR during a later operation, administered first aid to a soldier who had stepped on a jumping jack mine. The soldier had been walking point, moving carefully, using all the proper precautions, when the mine detonated. Both legs were gone, severed at mid-thigh by the blast. One arm was gone at the shoulder. The wounds were catastrophic, the kind that would have been unsurvivable in previous wars. But helicopter evacuation and advanced trauma care meant the soldier had a chance if he could be kept alive until the dust-off arrived. Hill kept the man conscious while waiting for the helicopter, talking to him, applying tourniquets that were immediately soaked through with blood, trying not to show the horror he felt at the injuries. Hill knew that this could happen to anyone at any moment, that his survival was a matter of which patch of ground you happened to step on, that the soldier bleeding out in front of him had done nothing wrong, had followed all the procedures, had just been unlucky. Years later, after returning to Australia, after the war had ended and the public debates about its purpose and conduct had become historical arguments, Hill's recollection of his time in Vietnam distilled to a single observation that captured something essential about the experience. We counted absolutely every single day that we were here. Every soldier did. 365 days in a tour for the first rotation, 12 months for subsequent rotations. Each day survived was a victory. Each patrol completed without casualties was cause for quiet relief expressed in dark jokes and studied nonchalance. Operation Pinnaroo proved that in the Longhai Mountains, the mathematics of survival had become impossible. The summer of 1969 brought the pattern into sharp statistical focus. By this point, nearly 2 years after the barrier minefield's completion, Australian intelligence had documented that thousands of mines had been lifted and redeployed. The casualties that had been scattered and sporadic in 1967 and early 1968 were now concentrated and sustained. Units operating in southern Phuoc Tuy province faced mine threats on virtually every patrol. The statistics, compiled at task force headquarters and forwarded to higher command in Saigon and Canberra, told a story that was becoming impossible to ignore or explain away. On the night of the 4th of July, 7 platoon from 5 RAR was moving to a night ambush position in the Longhai foothills when, at 21:07 hours, precisely documented in the unit's operations log, the machine gunner placed his weapon on the ground to adjust his load and triggered an M16 mine. Private Leslie Pettit was killed instantly, standing close enough to the detonation that the blast effects were immediately fatal. Private Jim Lowry and 9 others were wounded by fragments, several seriously. The platoon called for casualty evacuation immediately, following the procedures they drilled repeatedly. Safe lanes were supposedly cleared to allow movement of the wounded to a helicopter landing zone that had been used previously and was marked on maps as cleared. At 22:05, 1 hour after the first explosion, as soldiers were moving wounded toward the landing zone, Lance Corporal Paul Smith detonated a second mine. Smith and Private Hans Mueller were killed. The second mine increased the wounded count and transformed the evacuation from a difficult task into a crisis that consumed the entire company's resources for the remainder of the night. Among the wounded from that night was Sapper Robert Earl from 1st Field Squadron, Royal Australian Engineers, who had been assisting with the evacuation when the second mine detonated. Earl survived his wounds, though his injuries were serious enough to require extended hospitalization and eventual medical evacuation to Australia. His testimony, recorded years later in the Australians at War film archive as interview number 639, would provide detailed insight into Viet Cong mine tactics from the perspective of someone who'd studied them professionally and learned about them through personal experience. It was an M16 jumping mine. Earl recalled, his description precise and technical. They had put a snail on top of the 3 prongs, so all you would see was a snail. A snail, in daylight you wouldn't see it. In fact, I think it would encourage the blokes to walk on the snail anyway. He described the grenade booby trap technique with the specificity of someone who'd watched it work and understood its elegant lethality. They would set a mine, for instance, an M16 mine. They were pulling them up from our minefield, pulling a pin out of a grenade and sitting down, under the ground, and sitting the mine on top. The M16 to keep the grenade loaded and fill it in. When we'd come along, we'd see the mine and unscrew the mine, make it safe at the top, unscrew the detonating device out of it, lift the mine out, and when we did, the grenade would go off. Earl's testimony was valuable because it confirmed what intelligence assessments had suggested. The Viet Cong mine tactics weren't improvised or opportunistic, but systematic applications of specific techniques that had been developed, tested, and disseminated as doctrine. 11 days later, on the 15th of July, 3 platoon from A Company, 6 RAR, commanded by Lieutenant Peter Hines, engaged a 3-man Viet Cong reconnaissance party in a brief but intense firefight. The contact occurred in an area that had been designated as a likely Viet Cong approach route to one of the villages in the Australian operational area. The firefight was brief. 2 enemy soldiers were killed in a bunker where an M16 mine and an M26 grenade, almost definitely from the barrier minefield based on markings and condition, were found along with rice, medical supplies, and documents. The 3rd Viet Cong fighter escaped west toward the Long Hai Mountains despite pursuit. The bunker location was recorded. The captured materials were photographed and sent to intelligence for analysis, and the position was destroyed with explosive charges. 6 days after that contact, on the 21st of July, the same platoon halted for a morning break at 9:40 in the morning. The platoon carried a small transistor radio, standard equipment for many Australian units in Vietnam, who valued the connection to news and music from home. Lieutenant Hines had been alerted through the command network that a momentous event was about to be announced. U.S. Armed Forces Radio Vietnam was preparing to broadcast that man had landed on the moon. The Apollo 11 mission, followed intently by soldiers who understood the technical achievement it represented, had reached its climax. Hines went around informing his men about the Apollo 11 achievement, the lunar module's successful landing, Neil Armstrong's imminent first steps on the lunar surface. In the distance, B-52 bombers were putting in an airstrike on the Long Hai Mountains, the rumble of their ordnance audible even kilometers away. A reminder that while mankind was achieving its greatest exploration triumph, the war continued with its grinding routine of bombardment and patrol. There may have been some bunching in the area as soldiers gathered closer to hear the radio broadcast clearly. At that moment, an M16 mine detonated about 10 meters off the track the platoon had been following. The casualties from that explosion occurred while mankind's greatest technological achievement was being announced. A juxtaposition of human capability at its highest and most primitive that needed no commentary to convey its meaning. Soldiers were wounded while listening to news of men walking on the moon, injured by a mine laid by their own army, lifted by teenage girls, deployed by an enemy who was simultaneously primitive and sophisticated, depending on how you measured capability. In August of 1969, 5 RAR conducted Operation Esso, a major assault into the Long Hai Mountains intended to destroy Viet Cong facilities and disrupt enemy operations. Despite elaborate precautions, special training beforehand, all recommended protective measures implemented, mine detectors sweeping constantly, engineers leading advances through suspected mine areas, the operation resulted in 9 Australians killed and 58 wounded. Most of the casualties were caused by jumping jack mines. The operation's casualty rate, when calculated as a percentage of forces engaged, exceeded anything the task force had experienced in previous operations. The details of Operation Esso were initially kept from the Australian public under operational security protocols. But the continuous stream of casualties from the Long Hai area was becoming impossible to suppress entirely. Parliamentary questions were being asked in Canberra by opposition members who'd been contacted by families of wounded soldiers. Journalists were investigating, comparing casualty figures released officially with information obtained from soldiers' letters home and from contacts in the military. The strain on battalion commanders was visible to anyone who worked closely with them. Lieutenant Colonel Khan, the commanding officer of 5 RAR, was heard by multiple witnesses to curse the task force commander for sending his battalion into the Long Hai area at all. A breach of military protocol that indicated the depth of frustration and anger he felt, watching his soldiers become casualties from mines that shouldn't have been available to the enemy. Colonel Albie Morrison, commanding 9 RAR, threatened in front of his staff to shoot villagers from Dat Du if any more of his men became mine casualties. An extreme and ultimately empty threat that revealed the desperation and moral strain affecting leaders who were watching their soldiers die and felt powerless to prevent it. Morrison's threat violated laws of war and Australian military discipline, but it was never acted upon and no formal charges were filed, perhaps because senior commanders understood the psychological pressure that had produced the outburst. Orders came from brigade level. The operations continued. The casualties accumulated. By mid-1969, mine casualties had reached 41% of all task force losses, a figure that shocked commanders who reviewed the statistics and understood their implications. Brigadier C. Flint, the engineer-in-chief at Army headquarters in Canberra, visited Vietnam specifically to assess the mine situation. His inspection tour included visits to units in the field, discussions with engineer officers and battalion commanders, and examination of captured enemy mines and documents. He confirmed that mines had become a constant feature of the casualty reports, that the problem was growing worse rather than improving, and that the mines being recovered were overwhelmingly M16 devices that originated from the barrier minefield. Colonel P. Yong, the Services and Defense Liaison Officer of Armed Forces Vietnam, noted in official correspondence forwarded through channels to Canberra that the mines had become the biggest single casualty-producing weapon and the greatest single problem facing Australian soldiers in the province. His assessment, based on comprehensive analysis of casualty data and operational reports, concluded that the mine threat was affecting operational capability, degrading morale, and raising questions about the viability of continued operations in certain areas. Between May of 1969 and May of 1970, the period of peak mine casualties that would later be analyzed in detailed studies, M16 mines from the barrier minefield accounted for more than 50% of all Australian losses. At certain points during this period, the percentage spiked to 80%, meaning that for weeks at a time, mines were causing 4 out of every 5 casualties suffered by Australian forces. The mathematics were inescapable and damning. For over a year, Australian soldiers operating in southern Phuoc Tuy province were more likely to be killed or wounded by their own mines than by direct enemy action. Small arms fire, ambushes, mortar attacks, or any other form of combat. The strategic inversion was complete. The barrier meant to protect Australian forces had become the primary threat to their survival. The mathematical proof arrived in February of 1970 during Operation Hammersley, when the 8th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, learned through direct experience what the earlier operations had already demonstrated. The battalion had arrived in country just over 2 months earlier, completing the standard pre-deployment training in Australia and the immediate acclimatization period in Vietnam. They had already completed 2 operations, Atherton and Capera, in other areas of WWII province that hadn't involved significant mine contact. The soldiers were predominantly national servicemen, young Australians, conscripted under the draft system for 2 years of service, including 1 year in Vietnam. The draft system, politically controversial in Australia, meant that many of these soldiers had no particular desire to be in Vietnam, but were serving their mandatory obligation with professionalism drilled into them during training. They were well-trained and led by experienced officers and NCOs, many of whom were regular Army professionals with previous combat experience. On the 15th of February, an understrength platoon from C Company left Fire Support Base ISA to conduct an area ambush in support of engineers working an old quarry in the Long High Hills. The fire support base had been established with a section of 81mm mortars for indirect fire support, 3 Centurion tanks providing armored firepower and psychological presence, and a troop of M113 armored personnel carriers for mobility and additional armored protection. The mission was classified as routine security work, the kind of operation that should have been low risk, providing security for engineers conducting their tasks and deterring enemy movement in the area. The operation lasted less than 2 weeks. 9 soldiers from 8 RAR were killed, 40 wounded. Total Allied casualties for Operation Hammersley, including Vietnamese forces and attached personnel, were 11 killed and 59 wounded. 24 of those casualties, killed and wounded combined, came from just 2 mines. The number 24 from 2 wasn't an estimate or an approximation subject to the fog of war or the confusion of combat reporting. It was documented fact, recorded in operational reports filed at multiple levels, unit histories compiled contemporaneously, and medical records that tracked each casualty through the evacuation and treatment system. 2 mine explosions, probably M16 jumping jack mines based on injury patterns, almost certainly occurring during casualty evacuation from the first blast when soldiers bunched together around wounded comrades or when evacuation teams moved wounded toward landing zones, had disabled the equivalent of a full platoon, the basic tactical unit of Australian infantry operations. The operation effectively ended at that point. No tactical objective could justify continuing to operate in terrain where the casualty rate from mines made mission accomplishment impossible. The battalion commander, facing casualties that exceeded his replacement capacity and a tactical situation that offered no prospect of success, made the decision to withdraw. Operation Hammersley was later described in some accounts as the worst disaster of the Australian-Vietnam experience. A judgment that reflected both the concentration of casualties in a brief period and the fact that they came not from combat with a visible enemy, but from Australian mines redeployed by the enemy. The operation taught one ATF, and more importantly, the politicians in Canberra, the nasty nature of the war their forces were fighting in WWII province. The public impact of Operation Hammersley casualties was harder to suppress than earlier losses. Many of the dead and wounded were conscripts, young men whose families hadn't chosen to send them to war, but who'd been compelled by law to serve. Each casualty report fueled the anti-war movement that was gaining strength across Australia, providing concrete examples of Australian soldiers dying in what opponents characterized as an unnecessary foreign war. By 1970, Even senior military leadership recognized that the barrier minefield had to be cleared. The operational costs of the minefield far exceeded any residual defensive value it might provide. Australian engineers had begun the dangerous task of manual mine clearing in 1968, working with metal detectors and following careful procedures to excavate and neutralize each mine. The work was slow, exhausting, and deadly. Every mine could be booby-trapped with a grenade or secondary explosive device. Every detector beep might indicate an actual mine that needed to be cleared, or might just be metal fragments, shell casings, destroyed equipment, or other battlefield debris that generated false positives. The engineers worked in small teams, typically 4 to 6 men, with one operating the detector, one excavating suspected mines, one providing security, and others standing by to assist with casualty evacuation if something went wrong. Progress was measured in meters per day, sometimes meters per week when mines were densely concentrated or when booby traps were encountered. Progress was limited through 1968 and most of 1969. Engineers continued to take casualties while clearing mines that Australian engineers had laid less than 3 years earlier, an irony that wasn't lost on the men doing the work. Late in 1969, Major Rex Rowe, the commanding officer of 1st Field Squadron, Royal Australian Engineers, developed a solution that would finally enable systematic clearing of the barrier minefield. Working with American equipment provided on extended loan and modified to meet Australian requirements, Rowe and his colleagues designed large steel-plated rollers that could be attached to the rear of M113 armored personnel carriers or to M48 tanks. The rollers, heavy cylinders of steel plate welded together and mounted on axles that allowed them to rotate, would roll ahead of the vehicle at a distance of several meters, connected by a rigid arm that transmitted the roller's weight to the ground, but protected the vehicle from blast effects. As the vehicle advanced, the roller applied sufficient weight to trigger any mines in its path, detonating them at a safe distance from the crew. The innovation was elegant in its simplicity, the kind of practical engineering solution that emerged from persistence and clear thinking about the problem's actual requirements rather than its theoretical complexity. The rollers weren't sophisticated technology. They were simple mechanical devices that solved a specific problem through straightforward application of weight and standoff distance. The mine rollers finally enabled systematic clearing of the barrier minefield, though the work still took nearly 2 years to complete. Some sources indicate the clearing operations extended from 1968 through late 1971, a period of nearly 4 years compared to the 3 months required to lay the minefield originally. The discrepancy between construction time and clearing time reflected both the difficulty of the task and the fact that clearing had to compete with ongoing operations for engineer resources. While the engineers worked to remove the physical mines, a parallel reckoning was occurring in the political sphere. In August of 1969, journalist Peter Samuel published an article in Vietnam Digest, a publication that focused on the war and had a readership among policymakers and military professionals. The article exposed the minefield disaster to public scrutiny, with details that had been classified or suppressed under operational security protocols. No sooner was the minefield laid than it was abandoned to provide the Viet Cong with a wonderful supply of lethal weapons with which to kill Australian soldiers. Samuel wrote, his prose blunt and accusatory. It is difficult to express confidence in the leadership they have been given, either by the Army or the government. The article triggered parliamentary questions that the government could no longer deflect with vague assurances about operational security or ongoing investigations. Members of Parliament, armed with specific information from Samuel's reporting and from constituents whose sons had been killed or wounded by mines, demanded answers about who had made the decision to build the barrier, what warnings had been ignored, why the minefield hadn't been cleared sooner, and what accountability would be imposed on those responsible. Details that had been suppressed for 2 years became public knowledge, reported in major newspapers, and discussed on radio and television programs. The barrier minefield became a symbol of the government's failed policy in Vietnam. Concrete evidence that Australian forces were suffering from leadership failures at the strategic level. The institutional response to the disaster revealed how military hierarchies protect senior officers from accountability for failures that would end the careers of junior officers. Brigadier Graham, whose decision to build the barrier minefield had been made against the explicit advice of his engineering and infantry commanders, was promoted to Major General in February of 1969. Just as mine casualties were reaching their peak and Operation Hammersley was demonstrating the full catastrophe of his decision, he was appointed Deputy Chief of the General Staff and 5th Military Member of the Military Board, positions he held until 1972. Senior staff appointments in Canberra that put him at the center of military policy-making. No formal inquiry was conducted into the barrier minefield decision. No accountability was demanded at any level. Graham was never officially criticized, never disciplined, never asked to explain his decision in any public forum. Some defended Graham by noting that the decision involved approval from higher command. Headquarters 2 Field Force Vietnam, the American command responsible for the area, had provided the 20,000 mines and the M5 anti-lift devices, indicating that American commanders understood Graham's plan and supported the strategy. The mines came with supporting documentation, technical specifications, and recommendations for employment, suggesting institutional approval rather than individual initiative. Others argued that Graham had made the tactical decision, had been warned explicitly about the vulnerabilities, and should answer for its consequences regardless of whether higher command had approved or supported the plan. The debate continued for decades among military historians and veterans. Graham himself never spoke publicly about the minefield decision after his retirement. Graham retired with full honors in the 1990s after a career that included senior commands and policy positions. He died in 1996. The minefield remained the defining decision of his career, the one action that overshadowed all others when his service was evaluated. The final accounting came when the clearing operations were complete in late 1971. 55 Australians had been killed by M16 mines that originated from the barrier minefield, a number that represented individual tragedies behind each statistic. The dead included 5 New Zealanders who served with Australian units under the integration arrangements between the 2 countries. More than 250 were wounded or dismembered, suffering injuries ranging from minor fragment wounds to catastrophic amputations and permanent disabilities. Among the wounded were 13 New Zealanders. These casualties constituted approximately 10% of all Australian losses during the entire Vietnam War, a conflict that lasted from 1962 to 1972 and saw over 60,000 Australians serve. The figure grew more stark when examined in detail. During the protracted period from May of 1969 to May of 1970, 12 months that represented the peak of the disaster, M16 mine casualties rose to over 50% of all task force losses. At certain points during this period, the percentage spiked to perhaps 80%, meaning that mines were causing virtually all casualties for weeks at a time. First Australian task force records also indicated that over 200 Allied soldiers and civilians, overwhelmingly Vietnamese forces fighting alongside Australians and Vietnamese civilians caught in mine explosions, but including some Americans who operated in the area, had been killed and mutilated by M16 mines from the Australian minefield. The total casualty count from a single strategic decision made in February of 1967 exceeded 260 killed and 420 wounded. The lessons that emerged from the disaster took both tactical and strategic forms. Australian military doctrine was revised to incorporate specific guidance about mine warfare based on what the barrier minefield had taught. The new doctrine specified that minefields require constant observation and interlocking fields of fire for their entire length to be effective against a determined enemy. Anti-lift devices, no matter how sophisticated, are insufficient protection against patient adversaries given time and access to the minefield. Minefields established in populated areas carry the inherent risk of being turned against friendly forces if the local population supports the enemy. The political allegiance of indigenous populations determines whether defensive measures protect your forces or arm your adversaries with weapons they couldn't otherwise obtain. Counterinsurgency doctrine was refined to emphasize the fundamental principle that you cannot separate a population from insurgents if the population is the insurgent support base. Understanding local politics and cultural dynamics is essential before making tactical decisions that assume cooperation or neutrality from civilians. Force protection measures must be evaluated not just for their immediate defensive value, but for whether they might become force multipliers for the enemy under changed circumstances. What was not learned, or at least not immediately acknowledged within institutional structures, proved equally significant in shaping how the military processed the disaster. Graham's promotion, despite presiding over the catastrophe, demonstrated institutional unwillingness to hold senior officers accountable for strategic errors when those errors emerged from decisions made in good faith under operational pressure. The pattern would repeat in subsequent conflicts, with senior leaders protected from consequences, while junior officers and enlisted personnel bore the physical and psychological costs of failed strategies. The Australian commitment to Vietnam continued until the final withdrawals in 1972 and 73, despite mounting evidence that the war was unwinnable and that Australian casualties were being sustained for no achievable strategic purpose. The preference for secrecy over accountability persisted until journalists and parliamentary pressure forced transparency, a dynamic that would continue to shape civil-military relations in Australia for decades. The barrier minefield's influence extended beyond Australian military doctrine to affect international policy on landmine usage. The United States pursued similar barrier strategies during the Vietnam War, most notably the McNamara Line, an electronic barrier of sensors and mines across the demilitarized zone between North and South Vietnam intended to detect and interdict North Vietnamese infiltration into the South. The McNamara Line similarly failed to achieve its objectives. For many of the same reasons the Australian barrier failed: insufficient forces to maintain observation, underestimation of enemy capabilities to defeat the system, and inability to prevent the enemy from accessing and neutralizing components. The experience contributed to growing global awareness of the indiscriminate danger posed by landmines, which kill and maim civilians and military personnel for generations after conflicts end. In 1997, Australia signed the Ottawa Agreement, formerly known as the Convention on the Prohibition of the Use, Stockpiling, Production and Transfer of Anti-Personnel Mines, and on their destruction. Australia's experience with the barrier minefield, documented in official reports and veteran testimonies, informed the country's support for the global landmine ban and continues to shape current policy that advocates for mine-free warfare in international forums. The barrier minefield is now taught as a case study in military academies around the world. At the Australian Defence Force Academy, the Royal Military College Dun Truon, the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth, and the British Army Staff College at Sandhurst. The disaster serves multiple pedagogical purposes. It demonstrates how tactical competence at one level does not guarantee strategic success, how warnings from professional military advisors should be weighed carefully before being dismissed or overruled, how cultural misunderstanding can doom even well-intentioned strategies, and how institutional hierarchies sometimes protect senior leaders from accountability for catastrophic decisions that cost lives and undermine mission accomplishment. Greg Lockhart's book, The Minefield, An Australian Tragedy in Vietnam, published in 2007, brought the full story to public attention with comprehensive research drawing on declassified documents, veteran interviews, and Vietnamese sources. The book won the 2008 New South Wales Premier's Prize for Australian History and is now used in Australian school curriculums as part of Vietnam War studies, ensuring that future generations understand not just what happened, but why it happened and what lessons should be learned. The legacy of the barrier minefield remains inseparable from the broader Australian experience in Vietnam. Australian forces were tactically proficient throughout the war, as evidenced by their low casualty rates in most operations compared to American units operating in similar terrain, and as validated by the assessment of a former Viet Cong leader who stated after the war, "Worse than the Americans were the Australians. We were more afraid of their style." That tactical excellence, grounded in lessons learned during the Malayan emergency and refined through experience in Vietnam, makes the barrier minefield disaster more rather than less significant. It demonstrates that professional competence, extensive training, and hard-won experience from previous conflicts do not guarantee success when strategic understanding is absent or when fundamental assumptions about the operational environment are wrong. The barrier minefield's lessons echo across the decades, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful instruction comes not from victories achieved, but from the quiet mathematics of what happens when barriers are built in wars that require bridges.